treasurer, Susan Stratton as secretary, Anne Smith as editor, and Christina Kanalaki-Lowe. And we welcome John Moira and Elder Estevez, who have joined the committee. Many of you know these committee members and would agree wholeheartedly what a talented, agile, capable and committed group they are. We all look forward to serving on the committee and you, our members, with our program of events. I now have the great pleasure of handing over to Christina to introduce our speaker.
Thank you, Christine. Our presenter for tonight's talk is Glenda Korporaal. Glenda is a journalist who has been working for over 40 years for daily newspapers, starting with the Sydney Morning Herald, later the Australian Financial Review, and currently with the Australian newspaper, focusing on business. In 2019, Glenda received an OAM in the Australia Day Honours for her contribution to newspaper journalism. In her roles as a correspondent, Glenda has been stationed in many places around the world, including 6 years that she spent in America, where she became interested in the work of Frank Lloyd Wright. Returning to Australia, she became aware of the connections with Walter Burley Griffin and became very interested in the story of Walter's wife, Marion. Glenda spent around 5 years travelling in Australia and in the US, researching the Griffins, while still working and trying to pull out Marion's story as compared to Walter's. Glenda has written and co-authored several books, including Yankee Dollars, the story of Australian investment in America, and 20 Years of the Internet in Australia. She has co-authored 2 books on the Olympics and most recently has written Making Magic, the Marion Mahony Griffin story. Glenda, I'd like to invite you to share your screen and you can begin the presentation.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me to do this presentation. It's a pity we can't meet in person, but I think Zoom is a pretty good second, really. One of the reasons I was really pleased to be asked to do this talk was that Marion herself would have approved. That Marion, if you'd asked her to speak, she would have said yes. But Marion is a pioneer. She was a pioneer of her time. She was one of the first women architects in America, but she was an artist, a social observer, and an environmentalist. And I've called this talk Marion's Garden. She wasn't a gardener in a conventional sense, but because she was a passionate environmentalist and a lover of Australian plants and trees, in a sense, Australia was her garden. Now, this is a book I wrote, which was published about 5 years ago, and I'm trying to perhaps draw attention to Marion, but define her in a way through her relationship with two very famous men, Frank Lloyd Wright and Walter Burley Griffin. Now, in doing this, I suppose I was trying to, get people to know who she was. What I'm trying to do tonight, perhaps, is sort of show her through her own lens as an environmentalist, as someone who envisaged the world being her garden. And so what I want to do is through this lens and the lens of the people who are interested in your society to describe to you her passion for the natural landscape, particularly the Australian landscape. And at the end, I want to feel that I have given you a story about her body of work, which will allow us to assess her, in fact, in her own right. Now here's I'm just giving you a quick summary. That's a picture of Marion there, one of my favourite pictures. Notice her fingers there. She's sort of quite tense, really. She was quite a serious woman. So I'll just quickly go through her early career, Frank Lloyd Wright, her links with Walter, the Canberra plan, coming to Australia and her involvement with Cafe Australia, her forest portraits and Castle Crag, and then I'll try and bring together her legacy. Now, Marion was born in 1871 in Chicago in February, and this is a seminal year in Chicago's history because it was the year of the Great Fire. And Chicago was one of the growing cities of the Midwest. But this terrible fire happened when Marion was only 8 months old. Now, what happened was her parents decided to leave the sort of grimy, built-up Chicago and move to a place called Evanston, or just north of Evanston, in there. And there she had a most unusual upbringing. She would roam free. She had an older brother. She had an older cousin called Dwight Perkins, who I'll come back to in a minute. And she was very close to, so she was a tomboy. She would roam around. She talked about growing up with the Lake Michigan on one side. It's like a blue inland sea. And there was a whole river system, the Skokie River system, on the other side. So I'll just quickly read to you. She just loved being outdoors. She said, this was her comments, and she would observe the changing of the seasons and the different plants. And she said in the early spring, they would go down in the ravine and brush the snow away to gather the first heptaceas, white, pink, blue, and lilac. And there under the snow, the winterberries were found, and sassafras roots and slippery elm bark. And on to fall with its wild hickory nuts, black walnuts, butternuts, hazelnuts, and berries, raspberries, blackberries, blueberries, juneberries, wild grapes, and crab apples. And on to the winter snow, winter green berries. And Marion was a tomboy. She loved to climb trees and see the world from above. Marion said that what she wanted, town planning would allow people to live the kind of life that she'd live, and growing up in terms of roaming free around the environment. Now, one of Marion's, her older cousin, Dwight, who she'd grown up with, he was the one that encouraged her to go and become an architect, which was a highly unusual profession. In fact, very few women did become architects. He went out to work at an early age, and he was sent to an architect's office. Chicago was a centre of architecture. It was a growing area in the middle of America. But Dwight believed that architecture was a socially important profession. So that it was not just doing buildings, it was designing cities which had landscape and parks for everyone to share. And he went to MIT, and he in the 1890s, and he encouraged Marion to go. And so she graduated from MIT. She was one of the she was only the second woman to do a four-year architectural degree. Now, Marion was a great drawer. She was a great enthusiast for drawing, and she drew the natural world. And this was a drawing she did for a department store, Marshall Fields. And you can see she's got the fairy in the environment there with a little spider. Now, here's another drawing that Marion did. It shows her interest in bringing the natural world into the inside, and you'll see the hanging vines there, which you'll see becomes a signature for Marion's drawings. Now, this was a church. Marion was a member of the Unitarian Church, and this was a church that she designed, and she was responsible for. Now, have a look at on either side of the altar. You can see those signature hanging vines there with the pedestals. See the light coming in from the top through the stained glass windows, and see the mural at the back of the screen. Now, Marion first of all went to work for her cousin Dwight. Dwight fell on hard times, and then she went to work for Frank Lloyd Wright, and we're about the late 1890s, about 1895. And Frank Lloyd Wright was part of this larger circle with Dwight Perkins and Marion. Frank Lloyd Wright was born in Wisconsin, but he was attracted to the bright lights of Chicago, where there was so much architectural work, so much building work going on. And so they were working in downtown Chicago, but he built a studio next to his house. And what you're seeing there is this design for the sign of the studio, and that Marion helped design that. Now, this is the studio. This was part of Wright's studio. And this is where, in fact, Walter and Marion met. Walter joined the studio about 1901 and to work for Wright. He lived nearby. And so Walter and Marion worked together in this studio with Frank Lloyd Wright. Now, Frank Lloyd Wright he appreciated Marion's drawing skills. Now, this is a church called the Unity Temple. The original church had burnt down, and Frank Lloyd Wright was approached to rebuild it. But it's a very unusual design for a church. And so he got Marion to also to do the show, to depict it. And you can see the environment around her and her traditional hanging vines around to essentially sell this very unusual church design. And this is something else Marion did while working for Frank Lloyd Wright. It was a house, but he was using her to sell this unusual, quite geometrically shaped house. Again, you can see her signature trees around it, her signature hanging vines. And I don't know whether you can see it, but if you look underneath the flowers, right down the bottom, there's something that looks like a spider, and it's in fact Marion's initials, MLM. The other thing to be noted about this time is Frank Lloyd Wright was very interested in Japanese art and architecture, and Marion is starting to adopt in her drawing style a sort of a more Japanese approach. This sort of cozy, this cozy sort of life in the Oak Park studio was effectively smashed apart in 1909. It was a great scandal. Wright ran off with the wife of a client. The office was closed, and Marion moved back to work in downtown Chicago in a building called Steinway Hall. Steinway Hall was designed by Dwight Perkins, and Walter Burley Griffin was back there working. So Marion reconnects with her old workmate Walter Burley Griffin, and she sees him in a different light. Not having Frank Lloyd Wright in her orbit, she starts to appreciate Walter. They shared a love of nature. He himself was passionate about plants and gardening. And Marion recalls that as a boy, he would follow around his mother around the garden and pat the plants. When his parents moved into a new house, they asked him to design the garden, and he became a great student of plants. And Marion and Walter formed a professional partnership. Now, Walter had wanted to be a landscape architect, and he was told that that wasn't a proper profession, so he became an architect. But Marion was working on this particular house in Decatur, Illinois, and she asked Walter to help her with the landscape gardening. So the two got together, and eventually they married in June 1911. They became a husband and wife architectural partnership. Now, this is something Marion did on her own around the same time. She was asked to design a house for Henry Ford. He'd actually come into Frank Lloyd Wright's office, and this is Marion's design. It was never built, but it was She wanted to have it of natural stone, set into the environment with a garden setting, and it was on the Rouge River. It wasn't built, but that sort of starting to see Marion's style. Now, Marion and Walter, in this husband and wife partnership, were approached, or particularly perhaps Walter in the first instance, to do a housing estate on the edge of a city called Mason City, Iowa. And Iowa is the state to the left of Illinois. And Marion drew this vision. Now, this is a precursor to Castle Crag. It was an estate around a river, the Willow Creek, and Marion drew this in a. So the idea is that the houses are set into the environment, and this was. She later drew this on a yellow silk drawing. But this was her vision for this ideal city in Mason City, Iowa. And this is one of the houses in Mason City. Again, think Castle Crag, precursor to Castle Crag. Now, see her evolution of what I call these vertical Japanese scrolls. The house is made of stone. It's fitting in the environment, but it's a marketing poster as well. She's got the garden setting, and she's got the floor plan, and this is still there in Mason City today. So the Griffins. Around 1911, the second half of 1911, the Griffins were married, working together. They had Walter particularly was listening out. He knew that there was talk in the Chicago architectural circles that there would be possibly a design competition for the new capital city. And in fact, it was when they learnt about it, which was apparently not too long after their honeymoon, it was Marion who said to Walter, we have to do this. And Walter was saying, we're pretty busy. And so, but Marion sort of convinced Walter to enter the competition. So about November, December 1911, they were holed up working with their office for this, for the plan for Canberra. Now, essentially there's two axes, the water axis. Their proposal was to dam them along the Low River and turn it into a series of sort of basins and lakes. And also just to explain they were able to get topographical maps. They were able to get paintings of the sea. The British consul in Chicago was given quite a lot of information that they were able to access. And they were clearly determined that the city of Canberra, which wasn't called that at the time, but that be set into the environment. And so on the one side was the water access, and of course Marion had grown up next to Lake Michigan, and the other perpendicular is a land axis connecting the two mountains, the view from the Mount Ainslie across, and on the southern side there would be the parliamentary side, and on the northern side the idea was the people would be living there. Now, Marion threw herself into the drawings. These were cross-sectional drawings, which she did of the plan. It was a very detailed plan. You can see it's set into the environment, lots of trees, and that was their idea of a capitol. Up the top is where Parliament House is today. But you can see these drawings, which are in the archives at the moment, owned by the National Archives in Canberra, were a beautiful depiction of their vision for Canberra. And this is, I think, the drawing that Marion did, which I think won the judges' hearts. There they are in cold winter of 1911, envisaging their plan for Canberra. But you can see it's Marion's drawings, which sort of sells you this idea of a city set into the landscape. To cut a long story short, they ended up being invited to come to Australia, and in 1914 they came to Sydney. Now, the capital of that time, the capital of Australia at that time, was Melbourne, and Walter's job, in fact, was in Melbourne. But Walter had a quick trip to Australia in 1913, and they loved Sydney. So their plan was to sort of perhaps have a house in Sydney, and perhaps Walter would come back and forward on the train in terms of his job. But one of the first things, by this time, Charles Weston was horticulturist, was already in Canberra planting the trees. And so there was a sense of urgency the Griffins had to really get to know the Australian botany and trees. And Marion she actually joined first. She joined the Naturalist Society in August 1914, and Walter joined soon after. And they met up with local botanists and people who were members of that society. And one of them was Constance Laplastrier, Alexander Greenlaw Hamilton, and Edward Shiel, who worked in the Botanical Gardens. And they threw themselves into learning about Australian plants. Marion described how they would go for walks every weekend, go with these botanists and ask them and talk to them all weekend. Saturday, she said, was always kept free for the walks in the outlying districts of Sydney, anything up to 20 miles, with Miss Laplastrier, the botanist, identifying trees and shrubs and flowers. For Canberra must be planted the right way, except for the botanical gardens laid out to continents to make the possible study of world groups. It must be planted to Australian natives, and it must be planted to colour, segregation and combination done in full consciousness. They never resented, she said, of Constance and Edward Shiel, the 7-8 hour lectures they gave them on the soil conditions and the habits, for it was Canberra and the need was urgent. And by the end of the year, they were very well versed in Australian plants. And this is not them. This is them on a weekend walk in Melbourne, but on the outskirts of Melbourne. But I think you can see that they were always going on weekend walks. They were always going to the countryside and getting people to tell them about the natural environment. The Griffins had a plan. They bought some land. They had a plan to build a house on Parsley Bay. Again, you can see Marion's vertical Japanese scrolls there. Her idea that the house would be set into the environment. It was and the planting there, but it was never built. In the end, what happened was it was just too much for them to be living in Sydney and Melbourne, and Marion effectively had to move to Melbourne to be with Walter. Now, the Griffins, Walter was full-time doing the plan, or laying out Canberra, but the Griffins had this idea they would still have their own practice. And one of the projects that came into Walter was what we call Newman College. It was a residential college, a Catholic college at the University of Melbourne, and Walter was approached to design it. And Walter wanted to have a unique architecture. He wanted to do something very different, and so he designed this quite unusual, striking residential college. It was criticised at one point by a few people, and it was Irish Archbishop of Melbourne, Daniel Mannix, who actually backed Griffin and said he liked that design. But Marion this is Marion's drawing, and she was working on the plantings for that. Now, when the Griffins arrived in Australia, they saw Australia as an independent country that was breaking away from Britain. But when they arrived, I think they found Australia still very English. They found, and in fact, this was reflected in the attitude to gardens. And the way Marion saw it, she felt that the British and the Europeans had sort of imposed their will on Australians in many ways, with the use of European plants and flowers. And there was this disparagement of Australian flowers. She wrote to her family back in America that the European invaders had a real antipathy to local vegetation. Their attitude to gardening, she said, was completely destroying all the natural growth and putting in European plants. And Marion was determined, in fact, to argue as much as she could that for the Australians of 1914, 1915, 1916, that they appreciate their natural plants. Now, and this is Newman College as it is today. Another commission that came into their office was Cafe Australia. There was a Greek Australian called A.J. Lucas. He had anglicised his name. He had a cafe in Collins Street in Melbourne, and he approached the Griffins to redesign it. And by now we're in war, 1915, 1916. He wanted to have a cafe that the people of Melbourne could enjoy, and somewhere they could sort of escape from the cares of the day. Now, I think Marion threw herself into this project, and I think having seen her church before, you can see her involvement in it. You see the light coming in from the top, coming down. You're seeing the tree-like structures on the side and the pillars, and you're seeing ferns brought into to decorate it. Now, Marion had this idea of the pillars inside the cafe. She wanted to recognise and pay tribute to Australian trees and the unique trees. So she designed these two. One was a fig tree, another one was a tea tree. I think one was meant to be to design them, to make them, but she designed them. This is another room there called the Fern Room. You can see there they've brought lots of ferns. And this is pre-Art Deco. It's got an Art Deco feel about it, but you can see with the ferns there, she's bringing the outside into the inside. The tree, she designed the tables and chairs. And at the bottom of the chairs, you can see there's a spot for the ladies to put their handbags. Now I'm coming back to this mural. This mural was commissioned by the Griffins, but it was done by Melbourne artist Bertha Merfield, and it was called Dawn in the Bush. It was meant to depict a time when the sun is breaking over the bush and that there's a mist in the valley. Now the cafe was opened with much fanfare in November 1916. And Dame Nellie Melba was there. So Marion became very friendly with Bertha Merfield, but she continued to keep sketching plans, keep studying the Australian environment. And as she wrote in her diary and in her letters back to people in America, that when she was working for Wright, the aim was to depict his houses, show his houses, and she had to sort of compromise the veracity of the trees. But in Australia, she said she was throwing herself into drawing. She was able to focus on nature in its own right. So she felt she was getting her own confidence, I think, in drawing as a result of her enthusiasm for Australian trees and plants. And in 1918, she addressed the Women's Horticulturalists Association of Victoria. Her lecture was called Community Planning and Planting. And in her lecture, she argued the case that when planting gardens, Australians should use native plants. She said they should use at least 9/10 of native flora and 1/10 foreign material. I think that was about as much as she thought they would do. But there she is in 1918, putting this argument, telling Australians they should appreciate their own natural landscape. Now, Marion was invited on a sketching trip with her friend Bertha Merfield. We're talking about the end of 1918 here. Walter couldn't go, he was too busy, but I think in fact that was in fact good for Marion, because when Walter wasn't around, Marion would throw herself into her work. And they were on this sketching trip. They got the boat across to Launceston, travelled down to Hobart. They went to Port Arthur and also Southport. Marion was photographing, sketching, drawings, so this became, and this is a photo of some photos of Marion, Bertha and their friend Mabel Hookey, who are on this sketching trip to Tasmania. Marion was a keen photographer, and this is one of her photos of Port Arthur, or the area around Port Arthur. Now, this is, you can see the vertical Japanese scroll-like drawing, and people, these are we call them Marion's forest portraits. And she did one or two before she came to Tasmania. She actually photographed and sketched and did them when she got back. But this is sort of one of my favourites, and some of these forest portraits are in the Northwestern University in Evanston. But Marion had this sort of almost mystical feeling when she was particularly right down the south of Tasmania, that she was in this sort of very ancient land close to the South Pole, and seeing very different kind of vegetation. And she not only did the drawing, but she wrote detailed descriptions of what she saw. And then, so she said, here in Tasmania, where colour runs riot in everything, the long-lasting colours of masses of fruit outvying the flowers in their long-lasting conspicuousness. Here we find the barks putting on an equally amazing show. This eucalyptus, its bark is completely red, so fiery that paint cannot reproduce it. It was like a flame shooting up to the setting sun. Seeing this at sunset, I could not resist painting it so. The colour is there in the bark, no reflection of the sun's glow. Of all Lucifer's cohorts who painted this earth so magnificently, the angel who painted Australia was the greatest artist of all. And then she, here's another one she did in Tasmania. She talks again about being on the southern coast of Tasmania, where alone in Australia they have winter and summer, and winter as well as summer. The flora seemed to be especially varied. The plant life of the world, having originated about the South Pole, in Australia still holds the ancient custom of being evergreen through the year. We find broad-leaved evergreens, leaves of endless size and shapes. Stupid Europeans, she wrote, insist at times in planting deciduous trees in their midst, but they go dead every year and spoil the landscape. Here's another one, which she's talking about there. She writes next to this, Australian flora, the most ancient in the world, came from the South Polar regions and has developed the most varied species, each of which seems to have chosen its particular spot and conveniently doesn't invade the others. So when she returned, she turned those into beautiful silkscreen drawings, and she continued to do that throughout her time in Australia. And there was an exhibition of her forest portraits at Northwestern University, and it's put together beautifully in this book called Drawing in the Form of Nature, which you can get on Amazon, I think. What you can see on the front of the book there is the tree ferns, which I think she did in Russell Falls in Tasmania. And one of the things she wrote back, and I think this is one of the most moving quotes of Marion. She's writing back to her friends in America. I feel the archangel who painted Australia was the greatest of them all. Everything is so decorative, and to me, an architect, the function of painting is decoration, mural decoration. You don't have to be an artist there. The picture presents itself to you in perfection. You put it down as it is. Now, when Marion, over the few years, 1917 to 1920, she decided, in fact, to perhaps write her own book or booklet of Australian plants and to categorise them by colour so that they could be used, in fact, for anyone wanting to plant gardens or whether it was for their future projects. And this is the way she described these booklets, which are in the National Library in Canberra. I spent much time for several years in listing plants and all details concerning them in a tabulated form for use in any and all planting schemes. It was a very compact form, tabulated to show different growth requirements as soil, moisture, and so on, heights, shapes, and growths and colours of flowers, foliage, berries, and barks. So these booklets are in the National Library. The Griffins at one point moved out to Heidelberg. They built their own house. This was the first house they'd actually owned. It's a one-room house, and this shows them in their garden. It was called Foliota, which means little mushroom. But by this time in their lives, the late around 1920, Walter was being pushed out of the design of Canberra and overseeing Canberra. And to go into the details behind that, I think would take a whole nother lecture. But you know, when he arrived, he was a young 36-year-old. A whole lot of older public servants were resentful of him. And there was a lot of politics, as you can imagine, in a major project. Anyway, by 1920, he was, in fact, decided to opt out of his work in Canberra. But the Griffins, now we come to Castle Crag, because the Griffins had this idea of building an ideal suburb in Canberra, in Sydney, which was the place they loved. And so about 1920, 21, they bought some land. There was a consortium, they bought some land up in Castle Crag. And you can see at the time there, it was, people used to come there and cut the trees down for firewood. It was pretty denuded. But Marion and Walter sort of fell in love with the environment there, and they could see this as building perhaps this ideal suburb they hadn't quite been able to do in Mason City, and they certainly hadn't been able to do in Canberra. Now, Walter and Marion was determined that the suburb of Castle Crag be built into the environment, that there not be straight roads, that the roads be circular and fit the contours. It's quite steeply flowing down to the Middle Harbour. What you can see, though, also I think they were concerned about cars, that if you wanted to have families and children, the curved roads slowed down the cars. There were little walkways between the houses, and little in the back there were little parks, and so it was very much a sort of an ideal suburb. And Marion was very taken with this. And this is a contour map of Castle Crag, showing you the unusual, perhaps, road design. Now, Marion came up to Castle Crag. They had someone up there, but the person up there really wasn't selling the concept for their unusual houses. But you can see on the left-hand side, Marion's proposed drawings for the two initial houses along Edinburgh Road. They were called GSD 1 and 2 because GSDA was the Greater Sydney Development Association. So now we see eventually the Griffins moved up to Sydney, but it was really at Marion's enthusiasm and passion for them to move up to make sure that Castle Crag could be properly developed. And here's the beginning, the first few houses being developed. Now Marion continued her drawing and of the natural landscape. And you can see there by this time, the house is the minimal part, and she's looking at the trees. She's in love with the trees. And what she wrote with those trees was the botanists tell us this district has a greater variety of blossoms than any other in the world. Trees and shrubs are in blossom the whole year round in constant succession, in endless variety. This huge tree, the Angophora, loving the spectacular, chose the edge of the precipice, thus dominating the gully. The trunk of the Angophora may be round, or it swells out in one direction and narrows to a slender oval in the section in the other, according to each passing mood. This magical tree is quite restricted in its habitat to the Greater Sydney area, of which there are wonderful 3 promontories. And one girl, Wanda Herbert, described, she grew up in the Castle Crag area, and she described this sort of picture of the Griffins walking along with a wheelbarrow full of trees, planting gum trees, and just saying how strikingly unusual it was for people to be planting trees. And Marion was wearing trousers and no hat. So she was certainly seen as an unusual person. Here's another of Marion's drawings of another house in Castle Crag. Again, another one. The banks, they had a lot of trouble getting Castle Crag off the ground because the banks would not lend to people because the houses were so unusual. But again, you can see Marion using her drawing skills that she used for Frank Lloyd Wright, that she used for the plan for Canberra, trying to sell this suburb of Castle Crag. Again, when they moved back to Sydney, they're doing lots of weekend walks and with their friends to in the bushland. And while Marion was back in Australia, back in New South Wales, she continued her forest portrait, and this is one called the Illawarra Palms, which she did when probably about 1925. Here is the Grant House. You can see Marion's drawing on one side. The Griffins moved to the Grant House around the corner from GSD 1, and they lived there for most of their time in Castle Crag. Now here, this is a promotional video which was done of Castle Crag, probably I'd say 1928. Now there's Marion. Now these ladies would come out to see Castle Crag. It was all quite unusual, but Marion again was selling it. They desperately wanted more people to come to Castle Crag. They wanted people to invest and buy their unusual houses and create a community there. So Marion often entertained people coming in from the city. This looks like their driver, I think. And they had flat roof houses, and this was the Moa house. They had a party on the house. So it wasn't just architecture, it wasn't just curved roads. Marion was determined to build a community. Now this is a picture of Walter's father, George, came out to Australia. This is a picture of them in the garden of the Grant House. Now Marion and Walter didn't have children. I don't know, she was married at 40, but she loved children, and her philosophy for Castle Crag was that the children were always welcome, that Castle Crag will be a community where everyone looked after the children, and they were sort of celebrated and certainly part of the community. Marion also loved plays, and particularly Greek plays, and there was a part of Castle Crag which is called the Haven Estate, which they turned, little gully, which they turned into having plays. And this particular Haven Estate was bought with Marion's own money. It was an extra estate next to the original amount of area they bought. Marion convinced her mother to send her her inheritance in advance, and so they bought the area where the plays were, for the greater society. And Castle Crag became sort of very famous for the plays, and we're talking about the 30s here. Now, the amphitheatre or the Haven area at the moment is not usable, but it was continued to be used by the community of Castle Crag, and hopefully can be done again. Now, Marion and Walter went to India, where Walter sadly died. We're talking about 1937 here. Marion came back to Australia, to Castle Crag, and then she went back home to Chicago. And then I think she would have come back, but she was pretty well caught by World War II. And she ended up living with her niece, and living and dying in 1961 as sort of not very well known and certainly not very wealthy at all. This is a plaque to her in Graceland Cemetery in Chicago. So I want to sort of pull together what I think is Marion's legacy and try, what I've been trying to do is build up a case for Marion to be seen in her own right, but also to have her legacy, which is in many places, perhaps brought together and appreciated as one body of work. When Marion went back to America, she wanted to tell the world how wonderful Walter Burley Griffin was and what they'd done in Australia. By this time, she and Frank Lloyd Wright hated each other. There was a real antipathy. Frank Lloyd Wright was jealous that Walter had won the prize for Canberra. When she came back to Chicago, Frank Lloyd Wright was becoming very famous. So she wanted to write a book showing what they'd done and showing how wonderful Walter was. And this was never published, but it is, she called it The Magic of America, and it's subsequently been digitized by the Art Institute of Chicago, which you can access and search and read her writings. Now, I just want to go back to that drawing that Marion did in 1911 in that cold winter. This is her, this was the Griffin's sort of plan for Canberra. Obviously, the Griffins were not involved with the establishment of Canberra around 1920, but their street plan was gazetted in 24, so it's kept the bones of it. But when you look at this, you can sort of see, you know, is this Marion's garden? Well, certainly the ideas and visions that the Griffins had of Canberra, I think, has been preserved in many ways of a city built into the environment with lots of trees, with the lake in the middle. There's also the National Arboretum, which was opened a few years ago, and this is really worth a visit. It brought to life, I think, the Griffins' idea of having an arboretum and also having trees from around the world that people could see. And this is, if you visit it, is very, they've done a very good tribute to the Griffins there. Now, I just want to go back to these booklets, which are in the National Library. You almost can't, they're so precious, they won't let you touch them. And so they're not really accessible. But I would think, what I would like to suggest is somehow that they could be digitized, which effectively what happened with Magic of America, so to make it accessible, if somehow the National Library would agree to digitize it so we can see what she wrote, her colour coding of the Australian plants, and see her observations and perhaps start to respect the work that Marion did. So I think bringing together her body of work, there is her study and drawings of the Australian trees. Now to the left is her forest portraits brought together in a book. Now they're in America. Again, if you look at the photo on the right there, that's her picture of her drawings for Canberra. They're in the archives, and the booklets are in the National Library. So if there was some way, I think if you're assessing Marion's legacy, you have to sort of bring those elements together, and also include Castle Crag. So I suppose I'm arguing for people to, one, is there any way we can digitise the books in the library, and two, to consider her body of work as all these different elements. So I think I'll stop there and take any questions that you might like to give me.
Thank you, Glenda. There are a few questions, and I'll start first with a question from Christine Hay. Christine asks, was Marion's enthusiasm for Australian plants primarily aesthetic, that is to do with colour and texture, or was there an ecological component to her interest?
Marion wasn't a botanist, and she was, so I think more, I feel it's more, there was a passion of, she liked them. She arrived and she saw how unusual and different they were. So I think that she was an enthusiast, but she saw them. So I don't know as ecological, but there was almost this passion for Australia and to get Australians to appreciate their own trees. But she certainly was not a botanist or a horticulturist in any way. But I think if we looked at those booklets, we might see a little bit more detail, and they learned as they went along. And there might be a little bit more detail about how she'd assessed what plants are better. When they were designing Canberra, they had this idea that you would plant the hills of Canberra with different colours of Australian flowers, and hence Red Hill was meant to be planted in red. But Charles Weston, in fact, convinced Walter that you really couldn't get flowers from all around Australia. But anyway, I suppose that's a long answer to your question. She wasn't a botanist, but I think over time she came to learn about Australian plants, and she also felt that they certainly did a lot better in the Australian environment than the European plants.
Great, thank you. A question from Stuart Reid, and you touched on this in your talk. Do you have a sense that Marion deferred to Walter after coming to Australia? That is, put her career second to his? In her unpublished book, Magic of America, there is a description of a series of battles, national, civic, and personal. Stuart assumes that's with him, as in, not with Stuart, with her husband. Was it a battle, is the question.
Oh, no, the battles were, she saw herself and Walter against the world, and so there were battles that he had against these different forces. Certainly in Canberra, and that's a long story of all the politics of it, but he was fighting people left, right and centre. Some people just resented him being there. A lot of people thought that the plan for the lakes and damming the lakes was way too expensive, and that lake was not dammed until Menzies came and pushed it through, I think in 1961. So no, the battles were her feeling. Walter was always having to battle. In Castle Crag, he wanted things like putting the electricity lines underground, and the council, his houses faced the view, not the street, and he was constantly having battles because he was so unusual. But yes, you're right, she constantly deferred to him, and this is the hard thing in studying Marion, that she always almost erased herself from the equation, and always wanted to praise Walter. And the whole point of Magic of America is to say what Walter had done. But you're right there, when they were in America, they were husband and wife, successful architectural team. When she comes to Australia, she's definitely Mrs. Griffin. She's, the focus was on him. And he was seen as the amazing architect from America. So she was playing second fiddle to him there. And there are the odd signs of frustration. I think her move up to Castle Crag was a sign of her perhaps wanting to get Walter back from the various clients he had in Melbourne and start a new life in Sydney. But when you study her, the infuriating thing is that she constantly wanted to make Walter famous and sort of erased herself. But the battles were not with him. The battles were that he was always, because his ideas were so radical, that he was always fighting the council or fighting, fighting the powers that be in Canberra. And so she was very bitter, I think, that Walter had got pushed out of design in Canberra. I think both of them were very sad that they couldn't be part of the evolution of Canberra.
We have a question from Max. Was the Mueller House built for Willem Mueller, later Miller, who gave a series of lectures to Marion and Wall on horticulture when they were young and living in Chicago that stressed the importance of using Indigenous plants?
No, there was it was the Mueller House is in Decatur, which is about an hour due east of Springfield in the south of, in the southern Illinois. And there was in fact these two brothers, two Mueller brothers, and they were local business people in Decatur. So in fact, the commission came in first of all to Frank Lloyd Wright's office, and then because he disappeared off to Europe, Marion sort of continued it, and there's 3 houses in that cul-de-sac. So they were in fact local businessmen in Decatur. It's not that that other Mueller that you're talking about.
Janet Fingleton has mentions to everyone really, is asking, are people aware that the ACT government is trying to destroy Marion and Walter's vision of Lake Burley Griffin by filling in Wester Basin?
That's very controversial, and I know the Griffin Society, which I'm a member, has got reservations about certainly about that. But I'm not quite sure I'm across the details enough, but I know people are unhappy with it. I mean, their idea was that, you know, the shores of Lake Burley Griffin be open and for parkland. But yeah, that's I think that's a hot issue, but I'm not across the exact details.
Right. Stuart Reid points out that there's information on griffinsociety.org and griffinsociety.org.au that is available. But there's also a thought expressed that your work on Marion would make a great article for our journal, the AGHS journal. So that might be something to consider. There's a question about the tree with the red trunk in that painting that you showed us. Do you or does anyone else know what that tree is?
Yes, yes, she does describe what it is. I'll try and find for you what she called it. She calls it. I'm trying to think of what it was. The red tree, eucalyptus. Urgeria, U-R-G-E-R-I-A. I hope I'm spelling it right. That's what she called it, a eucalyptus urgera. And it was in Southport, I think, in southern Tasmania. So each time she's done the forest portraits, it is accompanied with very detailed descriptions of what she sees as well.
Well, that looks like all the questions that we have. Thank you. Stuart has put that up on our chat. So I might wait a moment or two in case someone is typing frantically. No? Well, Glenda, maybe you can stop sharing your screen if we've come to the end of the questions. This talk has brought to light Marion as an individual and a professional, quite separate from her well-known husband. I was very interested to hear you talk about the contribution of her artwork in the careers of Frank Lloyd Wright and Walter Burley Griffin, and the way it was used in selling their design concepts. I have spent many hours as an architecture student poring over books of Wright's work, never noticing who had created the delicately rendered illustrations. Most of all, I was delighted to learn that Marion was part of a movement of enjoying the natural world, that she, the joy that she had as a child in the natural world, she found also in Australia among our native plants and landscapes. It was interesting to learn that she was part of the early activism for protecting native landscapes. Glenda, I'd like to thank you on behalf of the Sydney branch of the Australian Garden History Society for bringing this talk to us and sharing those wonderful images of Marion's artworks and her work with, her art with Australian native plants. A small token of our appreciation will be sent by mail. Thank you, Glenda.
Thanks for having me. Yes.
You won't be able to hear any applause in this format, but we appreciate the talk. Before we close this evening, I wanted to announce the next event on Wednesday, the 21st of October. It's a talk on French gardens and will be presented by Angela Lowe. And members will receive information by email about this event. And but you can find the event by searching AGHS on the Try Booking website. Thank you. Thanks again, Glenda, and thanks everyone for joining us this evening, and good night.
Hello. Yeah.
Yes, thank you, Glenda.
Yeah.
A really interesting talk.
Yes.
Thank you,
Yes,
Glenda.
yes, I've got it as 8 o'clock in my diary.